Hello, friends, and welcome back to APIs You Won't Hate. My name is Mike Bifulco, API developer, consumer, sufferer, designer, all of those things, and coincidentally also host of the show for quite a while now. I'm excited to be sitting down today and chatting with a new friend to talk about a product that is very relevant to lots of API developers. If you have built a tool or product or service that relies on lots of APIs, you've probably also incurred spend and cost and sent dollars across the wire having to do with using other people's services. Like me, you've probably also heard nightmarish tales of people accidentally taking advantage of too much of a service and ending up with a $20,000 spend accidentally month over month because of a runaway for loop or something like that. And so I believe we'll get into answering some of the questions and some of this sort of neck of the woods, chatting with my new friend, Alex Klarfeld, who's founder of Supergood.ai. Alex, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, of course. I'm really, really glad you're here as well. I think I hinted pretty strongly at Supergood and what you're doing. Why don't we start with the elevator pitch of Supergood and I'll work back through your story from there. But yeah, tell me the 30-second pitch for what Supergood looks like.
Yeah, for sure. It's pretty simple. So it's a couple lines of code you drop into your code base, and we automatically monitor the cost and performance of your third-party APIs. That's it in a nutshell. The performance and cost piece, you can go into like a rabbit hole of like exactly what that means. I'm sure listeners of this podcast, like horror stories are popping into their heads right away when they talk about like APIs failing or causing problems and taking down parts of the business, causing executives to freak out over insane invoices. But those are all the problems we're looking to solve.
Yeah, got it. Well, you've certainly come to the right place. I am definitely one of those people who uses a lot of APIs that are sort of spend per usage, or at least on some monthly cost based on capped use. And I think lots of the folks who listen to this show will be really interested in that as well. Also should add that many of the folks who listen to the show are also builders of API-based products and would probably be interested in what you have to say about offering spend management tools to people and creating a user experience, end user experience for the people being billed that is, I don't know, most ideal perhaps. Before we get into that, I would really like to hear about your story before Supergood. So can you tell me a little bit about you before this and kind of how you got here?
Yeah, for sure. So before Supergood, I helped found a prop tech fintech company called Divvy Homes. Divvy, really cool mission. We were basically trying to help renters transition into homeowners. So we take folks who like maybe they couldn't get a mortgage today, but we thought they could get one in like a couple of years time. And then they would pick a house out, we would buy it for them, and then they would live in it. And each month, part of their monthly rental payments would go towards a down payment. And the idea is at the end of this program, we'd cash them out and we'd like help them get an FHA mortgage. So really cool mission. The sort of like nitty gritty inside was we built like an end-to-end home buying platform. So every part of the home buying process was all in-house software, which, was a lot of my responsibility for building. And as you can imagine, I actually sat down and counted. We had like 47 different third-party APIs that we had to integrate with. So it was the usual fintech suspects like Plaid, Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, Checker, you name it, all the payroll APIs. And then there's sort of like a long tail of a bunch of like real estate specific ones. And, two things would happen. I'm sure a ton of people listening can relate to this was, my day job is like building code, trying to build the best product for our customers. And what felt was like my night job was dealing with vendors. So like we'd get a bill at the end of the month, not to name names, but I will, but like DocuSign would like suddenly say like, hey, you guys are over and you owe us some crazy number of overages. And we're like, they would send us a graph, I remember very vividly. And we're like, how do we not have this graph? Like, it's like buried in logs somewhere and it's crazy. And the other part, what would happen is like a developer, these APIs would break in really weird ways. And it was like outages are easy to detect. Like it's down. Okay, what do you do about that? But like schema changes were a little bit more nefarious. Like the vendor suddenly upgrades their version and everything breaks. Another one that like schema changes were like value changes, like enums changing. That was pretty bad. The other one that was like worse, I'd imagine, is like data quality issues. Like all the hype that, someone trying to sell you an API can give you, like you really don't know until you run it in production and like against real customers. And then once it's in there, you have to like continually analyze to make sure like you're paying like a non-zero amount of money to that. So better get the most bang for your buck. So these were the two problems I kind of ran into as Supergood was like the sort of data quality, keeping up with like the version of the APIs. And then they kind of like all boil down to like the bottom line of our company. Like we were running customers through this application flow, hitting a gauntlet of APIs. And it was just like would make or break our business depending on how the API performed and how much it costs.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people maybe haven't experienced until they're sitting at the helm of a company is that a lot of your success or failure once you have a product that people are buying is getting down to unit economics and driving each user's experience to profit for you and value for them in whatever way that means, depending on the company. And it's a really hairy problem to solve. And every dollar that goes out the door in the name of making your customers happy is, working against you and effectively in that sort of unit economics game. It's a tricky thing to wrap your head around, especially if, you've spent your days studying, say, computer science and worrying more about merge sorts than like the realities of a consumer facing product or even a B2B product for that matter.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I don't know if you mentioned before you built Divvy Homes and before you built Supergood, what was your background? Or you come from a prop tech background? Are you more on the business side? Are you a sort of straight up and down developer? Like how is your career path shaped where you are now?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a full stack developer through and through. I studied electrical computer engineering in college, like made my way from like embedded software into like web application software. From the Midwest, moved out to Silicon Valley based on some friends that came out here and just got fascinated by the ecosystem. But I've always been a full stack developer, sort of master of none, I like to say. But I just love the breadth that sort of gives me and like really being able to like dig into very specific problems. I also love product. So just combining like the two parts of like just like building things. I care a lot about the what that I'm building more so than a lot of like much better developers than me care about like the how. So that's kind of me.
Sounds shockingly familiar. I feel like in a lot of ways I'm looking in a mirror there. Can you tell me then about, have you worked on developer facing products before? Divvy Home sounds like it was more consumer facing, but this is really building for developers or dev teams. Is this your first time around the block with that?
Pretty much. I worked at a company it was very interesting. It was tools for like data engineering teams. It was founded by he was founded by the creator of Postgres, Mike Stonebreaker. So we were building for Fortune 500 companies basically, and like the development teams in there. So that was the experience. And then at Divvy, we had a very cool consumer facing application. But the sort of like iceberg below it was building for ops teams actually, because we had like an operations, like it was like software powered ops company.
Got it. Yeah.
So no developers specifically, but I'm familiar with like working with like the in-house folks. Those were usually the people I had to work with when I was like dealing with API issues, because it was typically like an ops person or like someone on underwriting is like, I don't know why a bunch of customers are starting getting stuck in our application flow. It's like, all right, well, Experian is down. And that kind of explains it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. And I guess the other thing is, as a, self-assigned full stack developer, you've probably been subject to many other developer products along the way too. So I think
Yes.
that buys you some familiarity with it at the very least.
Yeah, I've been a huge consumer of these APIs, and there's great ones, and then there's not so great ones. And my goal with Supergood, my long term vision is I want to make all the APIs great. So like the ones that are great are like killing it in the market. Like Plaid, I'd say like they're so ubiquitous, but they're ubiquitous for a reason. Like the documentation is incredible. The onboarding experience for developers are incredible, and like, I think also like Stripe is one of the top dogs in terms of like developer experience. And I like just a long tail of folks who like either just getting started out or don't have the resources to invest. And I just want to like bring everyone up to the level that like the Stripes and Plaids of the world have set.
Sure. Yeah. It's an extremely high bar to hit. It's one of those things that I think a lot of dev teams aspire to, especially if you're building things for other developers to use. We as developers tend to be really good at sniffing out things that we don't like for whatever reason. And metaphor is a really powerful tool there, like saying, hey, Plaid's version of this is so much better. Why isn't this more like Plaid? Or, what were they thinking when they got here is a very common thing. And usually by way of comparison, like, oh man, I really wish that was like Stripe's webhook interface or whatever it may be. We also
Exactly.
very nearly made it to 10 minutes into the podcast without me having to give the disclaimer that I also previously worked for Stripe,
Oh,
which
cool.
is just something I feel like I should call out on each and every mention of it for clarity and transparency and all that.
Cool.
Okay, so we touched a little bit on the elevator pitch for Supergood. So the tagline, I think, on your site says something along the lines of like curb your API spend before you get a bill, which is super cool. And I get the mission from that. You also mentioned that it's something like a 2 or 3 line implementation to do that. So I'm curious about that. What does that look like? How do I integrate with Supergood and start getting benefits from it?
For sure. So Supergood is the way that it works today is for a free version. It's a passive interceptor. It's not a proxy. So the way it works, all the clients or SDKs are open source. You can check us out on GitHub. You drop in the few lines of code, and we basically apply a light monkey patch to like your favorite HTTP library. And then what it does behind the scenes is like as calls get, made in your application, we kind of stow away the calls locally in memory. And then what we'll do is basically redact everything. Like there's one of the big things that I take very seriously is we do not want to have any data that we should not have. So everything is redacted by default. You can set that flag. And then once on an interval, those logs will get shipped to our service, which will start to analyze from a cost perspective, data quality perspective. We're sort of like just running live analysis on your HTTP logs specifically in order to solve this problem.
Got it. And so it sounds like it's a client-side integration. I mean, I would imagine there's a server-side element to this too. Wherever API calls are happening is, I feel like one of the things that my API dev friends would ask is, what does that look like in terms of performance hit? Are you getting in between my call and the service, or is this truly something that is just like queued, saved for later?
Yeah, we intentionally built it to get out of the critical path. So that is why it's not a proxy. So it doesn't mess with any like actual network traffic. There's no like network call between the call that you're making. The only limitation is like memory, like the memory limitations of the machine that you're running on, because all it is dropping the call into like a memory store locally and then running redaction on the JSON. So it's very minimal latency hit, just like completely memory bound to the machine that you're running.
Yeah, fascinating. It's a very interesting angle. I can imagine the challenge of trying to track billing for every API call is the every API call part of that. So what have you done to try and determine like which of these calls I'm making out of my service are ones that are metered in some way? How do you determine who's billing me?
Yeah, exactly. So when the calls come in, we basically run it through categorization right away. So try to figure out like easy ones like domain is specific to the vendor. The harder one is each API has like a different signature. For example, like S3 uses like the subdomain to like identify calls, but like maybe certain plaid calls use the path, and then sometimes they'll stick a ID somewhere in there. So the first step that we do is sort of like categorize the calls. So as they flow in, we'll try to automatically categorize them best we can. We actually use LLMs for that. It's pretty good. And then sort of like we can manually re-categorize things if they're not like being grouped properly. And then after that, we kind of have like a toolbox of like the standard way that people bill. So like we know how OpenAI and Together like all bill, and Plaid also bills specifically based on like accounts rather than usage. And then we sort of built this flexible framework on our end where we have the tools basically to just implement custom billing. Like if you're like overage based, where it's like you get a certain amount of calls for a certain value, anything over that, it's more value. We can basically fine tune it to your specifications. But like for free users right away, it's just like drop us in and get usage. And then the sort of like more advanced metering for like the long tail APIs, we charge for.
One of the things that I'm fascinated by is that it sounds to me like the hello world is drop a snippet in and the product sort of starts sprinting away and going to work for you.
That's right.
That's really cool. What did the first version of this product look like? Like, did you target one API in particular, or were you starting from categorization from day one?
Yeah, the first version of the API was just a node library that like monkey patched fetch and then just logged all the calls. I think like a lot of people like out of the gate are like, I have Datadog or sort of Sentry to do that. And like the first version that we built at Divi was like trying to use Datadog to do this. And it's really hard. Like it's just a very like both like expensive from like a cost perspective where you have to like triangulate everything, like every single thing that you need to meter, you need to like tag and instrument appropriately. Plus the sort of like dashboarding and setting up of it is like hard. And sometimes like there's a lot of like, native knowledge to the team that's like one person that understands the Datadog logs. And then you also have to like maintain it. So like not only is Datadog going to charge you per like field that you're indexing, you're gonna like have to continue to maintain it. So first version of this honestly was like tried to build in Datadog, super hard, very difficult to maintain. Second version of it was like a custom logger, which is more similar to what Supergood is today. And then really was just a graph on a screen. There's just like, here's a bunch of vendors you use, and then here's like their associated usage. Get ready for the invoice and kind of like building on from there.
Yeah. Okay. And so if let's say I've integrated with Supergood, it's starting to measure metering for the various APIs I'm consuming. What does my end user experience look like with Supergood? Is it a dashboard I get? Do I get a series of emails? Is it a CLI? Like, What's my, how do I get an insight into what this all looks like?
For sure. So we have a dashboard, though as an engineer myself, I do not want to give engineers another single pane of glass to look at. So it is meant to audit if you want to. The two ways that we mainly interface with folks is through alerting. So right now we have standard Slack alerting set up. So if it's like you start to notice overages, spikes in the bill, you'll get a Slack alert. And then also like sort of a weekly report. So at the end of the week, you'll say, okay, this is sort of like the usage that we've been seeing. If you have uploaded like your contract information, we'll sort of be able to like give you a heads up that like some sort of renewal is happening. And then the sort of the other suite of tools we have is around like data quality monitoring and like more of like the nitty gritty error monitoring, where it's like, okay, we see an error that we haven't seen before. We just want to flag this to you to make sure it's not taking down another system. Because a lot of these errors that issues have can go quietly, mostly because even if you have instrumentation set up and like the best tools, which we use personally, like Sentry and Datadog, they get noisy because APIs might error for a non-error reason. For example, like if Plaid, someone disconnects their account, you're going to get errors all the time every time you pull it, but like it's not really an actual error, so you tend to ignore it. But if you have like 80% of your calls to Plaid totally disconnected, it's probably something that you shouldn't ignore to save some money at least.
Sure. Yeah, that all sounds very familiar. Actually, I spent a non-trivial amount of time just this week debugging an error with Twilio. We were getting an error response from some API calls, and the API call is basically like Mike and Alex are texting each other. I have a text conversation with you over SMS, and if I send an API call to say, please add Alex to this conversation, it fails, sends a 409 back. And the docs for Twilio say, like, if you get this error, probably just ignore it. But it's, when you start getting that error a lot, it sends up a lot of signals. And especially if that was something that was billed, it's something I'd want to know about. But it may also just be a signal from my tooling that we're trying to do something we shouldn't be, right? It may be a non-breaking error or maybe a breaking error, but it's a little hard to ascertain from the beginning. And I would certainly want to know if all of my, or 80% of my Twilio calls started failing in a hurry too. That's a great angle to take.
Yeah, and like it just feels like pushing a boulder up the hill. Like even if you instrumented something to catch that specific error, and you put all the instrument, like, okay, this is a thing that we need to like alert if it's only exceeding a certain threshold. There might be another one that's like probably going to come up in the meantime. And it's just sort of never-ending battle. That's why, like, as an engineer, it's like just drop us in. We handle like the instrumentation remotely. Also, like APIs are like there's like a finite schema for each of them. Like there's documentation, there's a lot of data that sort of like confines the problem space. So like, why not utilize that rather than trying to set everything up on your own?
Sure. Yeah. To that end, I'm curious for devs who may be listening who build API products, is there something they can do, or is there a way for them to integrate from their side to ensure that Supergood's understanding of their API is correct? Do you consume anything along those lines to say that, like, don't let the LLMs decide, let the product owners themselves configure it?
Yeah, actually, so part of our pitch is we want to also help out the API vendors. We're starting to roll that out right now, where basically we want to help give the same experience that the Plaids and the Stripes of the world give to their customers to those API vendors. So that integration is a little bit different. We basically don't want to get in the way of any sort of like live traffic as well. So we'll actually hook into the API vendors' logs themselves and sort of start using our tool. Like the first version of this product is basically like building out internal dashboards if they don't already exist, and then surfacing that information up to the sales team or supports teams so that like they can provide a better experience for their customers. Like some of the best API experiences I've had are from like, honestly, like Sentry and the Datadogs, where they're like, hey, your usage is about to exceed what you pay for. Just like want to give you a heads up. And that's just like not the norm. So we want to kind of help the API vendors themselves make a better experience for the customers, like engage customers when they notice they're having issues, engage when like there's spikes in usage. So that's also like a pretty big focus of ours, is like building a product for the vendors.
Yeah. As a vendor, there's many things to get right there. Pricing is a tricky challenge because it needs to ensure the vendor can make money, but also that there's an on-ramp for users to start at a reasonable level, and that they don't have to, invest a ton to prove that the thing is useful and valuable. At the same time, I would imagine some of it is also trying to be competitive with the competition and making sure that comparable services, don't underprice or overprice you, or whatever the optimization challenge is there. To that end, maybe one of the things I'm curious about, and I had kind of noted to ask you about, is tell me a little bit about Supergood's pricing.
Right. So we just released a free tier. You can download it for free. We basically limit to like, we won't actually block you because I don't believe in that sort of sales tactic, just as like an API consumer who goes overage, we're not gonna overcharge you for that. We'll hopefully have some conversations to start, but the free tier is basically 100,000 calls a month. You can set up pricing for 3 vendors automatically, and then sort of like track usage from the rest of the vendors for free. The idea is like we don't want to charge you for the vendors that like work and aren't really expensive. Like you shouldn't have to pay for like tracking like maybe Google APIs or
Mm.
like Stripe's APIs because those just work. So the best customers are the ones who are like, yeah, we like have a specific set of APIs that we want to keep an eye on from price and like quality and usage. And those are the ones that like we also want to provide value for. So that's the way that like philosophically, like we're trying to price is get that for free. And then everything else is sort of like the enterprise part where you have more than 1 million calls. You have all sorts of vendors that you want to sort of keep an eye on. That's sort of like dependent on the enterprise itself.
Okay, that makes sense. I feel like there's a pretty big delta between 3 APIs and 100,000 calls and enterprise grade. The question I would have there as a potential consumer is when I get to 100,001 calls and 4 vendors, like what is the on ramp like there? Am I jumping from zero to thousands of dollars a month? Is it like what's the scale of initial costs, I guess, for someone who's incrementally adding?
Yeah, and like our goal is like onboard slowly, especially like with growing companies. Like you just don't know how many APIs you're going to use, and I, for one, don't want to be someone who's like, oh, surprise, you added like another LLM. This is like adding to your bill. So we basically try to give 30 days free to monitor every single API at any volume just to make sure that like, okay, is this an API that is like worth monitoring and worth tracking? And the idea is at the end of the 30 days, you tell us and say like, yeah, I want to keep tabs on that or I don't. And then we basically discard it or like there's a way that you can set to ignore certain vendors inside of our UI to just like turn them off right away. So it won't stop working. We'll just stop tracking if you choose to stop tracking that API.
Sure, got it. I'm going to press a little further only because I feel like
Yeah,
it's
please.
my solemn duty to do so. But like, what's the scale there? Am I looking at hundreds, thousands?
Scale in terms of like the volume.
No, sorry, in terms of cost, right? So like when your customers convert from free to paid, maybe for the smallest ones who are growing, what does that tend to look like for their incremental?
Yeah, for sure. So if it's pushing 1 million calls upwards, we basically start at like 99 a month and then 10 million calls upwards, like sort of like custom pricing based on that. But
Yeah.
again, if it's 1 million calls to like Google, doesn't like probably something you don't need to track. So it's like
Sure.
more of like 1 million calls like OpenAI a month kind of thing is like $100 a month.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That to me is a narrative that I think is easy to sell too. Like the scary thing is if the product you're using to manage your spending becomes a giant spend to manage the spending, then it's like, an Ouroboros of challenges to upsell through the product stack there too.
No, I'm very cognizant of that. Like all the ways that vendors have hurt me with pricing is like not something that I wish to incur on like my own users. So the idea is to be transparent and like not screw up their business as much as possible.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. I think that's a good angle to take. And especially like I alluded to before, I think developers are really good at sniffing out when they're being toyed around with. And, they're the first ones to head for the hills if something feels fishy.
Yeah. I don't really blame them. I've done the same.
Right. Yeah. You are one of them. So it makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So tell me what's next. Like what other problems are you starting to think about? Or maybe do you have releases coming that you're excited about? What are you working on now?
Yeah. So you can download the Supergood tracker for free at Supergood.ai, create an account. One of the things I hate is trying to test out a dev tool with like talking to a salesperson. So you can do it for free without talking to any of us. We'll add you to a Slack channel just to help you get onboarded async, but drop us in, check us out, kind of go off to the races from there. And then the sort of like longer term is we want to help the API vendors themselves. So I'm starting to talk to the vendors that we're already monitoring today to try to make a better experience for the customers. The current integration today is if we have a special partnership with these API vendors, you get essentially premium support through us. So you're the first to know if these vendors have issues. Our Supergood will know before the status page updates just because we already have a bunch of the data going. So like if you're having an issue, one other customer is having the issue, we joke it's like the age-old problem of like debugging an API is like, is it us? Is it them? And we try to answer that pretty quickly. And yeah, just trying to make the vendors have the best experience for their customers. And then also trying to get into larger enterprises. So we actually have a eBPF agent also in the works, which is targeted towards like larger enterprises. And happy to go into detail of that. It's an interesting technology, but it's like a little bit more robust than making a code change. It's more of like infrastructure change.
Yeah, interesting. So it's more gateway level, presumably, or like more broad level where maybe you have dozens and dozens of different software stacks through an organization, and it's hard to just add 3 lines in one place and be happy.
Yeah, exactly. So trying to gear up for that. So it's an agent that
Yeah,
sits next to your box and does the same thing as the logger, but does it on like the kernel level and then performs the same way. It's just a little bit more effort to debug. It's usually teams that have DevOps teams already set up, but
sure.
we started with the logger because that was the easiest way I thought that we could integrate to.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think one of the interesting things about what you're working on at Supergood is that you get to interpret and traverse and feel parts of the software stack, the protocol that a lot of developers don't think about. Like you're making some really interesting network requests. You're sniffing out for certain shapes of things. Patching fetch is like an idea that I've never even remotely considered, right? But it's a super cool thing to be able to do and to kind of monopolize isn't the right word, but utilize as an opportunity creator for you, and certainly a value add for developers. Maybe this is a good segue into one of the other things I was interested in is like, tell me about your team, the size of the team building this thing and the tech stack. What does that look like right now?
Yeah, for sure. So we're a really small team. There's 3 of us. We're all engineers. The tech stack is pretty straightforward. I'm a big fan of TypeScript. So all the web application stuff is done in TypeScript, and a lot of like data processing is also done in TypeScript. We actually utilize Neon. So I'm a Postgres stalwart. Like, I just think it's the best. Hopefully that doesn't lose me too many favors, but there's a really cool technology called Neon that helps like, it does like serverless Postgres. I'm a huge fan of it. It's greatly increased our developer productivity. Being able to like clone a database immediately in the cloud behind your VPN just makes development so much faster. So we use
Yeah.
Neon for Postgres, and you can also like set up multi-tenants very easily with them. And we deploy on a combination of like render for the front end stuff, and then a GCP for a lot of the back end stuff, and then just using like core GCP stuff like a Cloud Run and things like that.
Yeah.
Pub Sub
Yeah.
and GCS.
What I really like about your product, and a thing that I really like talking to founders, is when you hear about a product that has such an interesting and simple implementation story, and then a lot of it is just good fundamentals and a solid idea for how to help people, and not having to go spend 10 years like researching a brand new, I don't know, algorithm, not having to do what OpenAI did and figure out how to make an LLM a thing to begin with. There are loads of opportunities for, enterprising people to go and solve problems without having to, I don't know, level up computer science as a theory, right? And it's a really cool sign that you're onto something that is an interesting value add and also just fundamentally probably a helpful thing too. That's super cool.
I appreciate that.
And the team
It's
size of
very
3 is
nice.
pretty impressive for what you've built too.
Thanks. Yeah, they're top engineers. I'm a big fan of them.
Yeah, cool. Well, Alex, before I let you move on, I've got a couple of questions that I want to make sure I don't skip.
Yeah, for sure.
Where's the best place for developers to find Supergood online and to get started with it?
Yeah, for sure. So you can check us out at Supergood.ai.
Cool. We'll send them that way straight away. And maybe what's a sign that someone should be considering using Supergood?
If you've ever got a bill that someone has been very confused by, that's one. If you have a horror story in mind where you're like, this API caused me to wake up in the middle of the night and heartache, that is a good sign that we might be helpful. If you have more than, I'm going to call it like 5 APIs, like if you're the best customers that we have are like kind of like they've started to think about their unit economics. Maybe they haven't like implemented things yet, but if you're like a smaller company, you probably are just like, hey, I'm just trying to grow. So I don't care that much about like watch these APIs. We're just going to chuck stuff at it, which I've been in that place too. So typically like larger companies are just starting to think about this problem. And also if you're dealing with international APIs, we actually have a pretty large contingent of international vendors that we've been working with to monitor. They are working pretty hard to get up to snuff with some of the US based vendors. So that's a pretty good one. So anything expensive too is great. Like the Twilios, Stripes, Plaids. Oh, if you're working with any credit bureau, also, I'd love to talk to you. They have a special place in my heart because they've been pretty difficult to work.
No doubt. Yeah. Wow. That makes it super easy. If you have just listened to Alex and you fall into any one of those buckets, get in touch stat. Alex, then where's the best place to find you online?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. I respond to DMs on both. So please hit me up. You can find me on GitHub too if you want to watch me write code, but that's a little less exciting.
Well, I will make sure that there's links in the show notes to everything we've discussed, ways to get to Supergood and to you and Twitter and LinkedIn and all the other places. Alex, I really appreciate you coming and hanging out and telling us a little bit about Supergood. Thanks so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it too.
Of course. Alex Klarfeld, we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
All right, see ya.